Hello, everyone, and welcome. Happy Wednesday, and welcome to today's weekly walk. It is Wednesday, June, not yet July, Wednesday, June 28th, 2023. My name is Carla, and on today's weekly walk, we will be taking a little walk through nature that may look a little familiar to some of you, but we'll be talking about how we keep Central Park looking so clean and green, and a little bit about how we have done that over the years in different ways. But before we get started, of course, we want to review our Zoom housekeeping items so that you know how to use your features in Zoom. So please feel free to use the chat feature, which you can use to add any comments or say hello, let us know where you're viewing us from. And a reminder that if you don't wish to see the chats, you can also close your chat window. You should see a little X, and you can also uncheck where you see chat in your Zoom toolbar. You can click the little down caret and uncheck show chat previews. And that way you don't have to see the little messages popping up. You'll just see the number of the chats appearing. And then, of course, you can use the Q&A feature if you have any questions for us, and my colleague Jose will be on the back end to answer any questions you might have throughout our walk together today. And you will also be invited to participate in a poll, so be sure to let us know what you're thinking when that is launched during our walk today. So today, of course, we're going to be talking about how we keep the park looking so clean and green, and that is right in keeping with our mission here at the Central Park Conservancy, which is to preserve and celebrate Central Park as a sanctuary from the pace and pressures of city life, enhancing the enjoyment and well-being of all. Now, on our walk today, this path may look a bit familiar, and that's okay. We are going to be starting at 72nd Street and then making our way north along the west side there and then ending at the Yard. So we are going to get started here, entering the park at 72nd Street. And even on a cloudy day with a threat of thunderstorms, you can see that the park is filled with many, many visitors already. And of course, in a single year, Central Park sees over 42 million people. And that works out to be roughly something around an average of 115,000 visitors a day or more. So with all those visitors and all those folks enjoying the park, how do we keep the park looking as amazing as it does? Well, that's exactly what we're going to touch on today during our walk. So without further ado, let's get into the park. And as soon as we enter, rather than joining those throngs of people, what we're going to do is take a little turn here onto a nice little mulched path and immerse ourselves in nature, just as the original designers of Central Park would have liked us to do. And right away, as we make our way down this little mulched path, right on our left, we see a rose bush that is pretty much finished. But we also see a little bee who is still trying to collect every last piece of pollen out of these roses that are pretty much otherwise finished. But this very diligent bee is making sure to come by and collect every last piece, which makes me think of our very hardworking staff and volunteers who work very, very hard to collect every last bit of trash and recycling and other items throughout the park in their awesome efforts to keep the park looking as great as it does. But we'll talk more about that in just a moment. And as we look down the path that we're going to walk down, it's looking pretty clean, especially considering this is a path right next to the perimeter of the park. Also looking amazing are these hydrangeas that are right on our left, covered in some of the rain from the weather that we've been having recently. And these are really giving us a beautiful spectrum of pinks and purples and lavenders and blues. And what's interesting that you may already know about hydrangeas is that they are basically like a natural pH indicator for the soil. because their colors are dependent upon the acidity of the soil itself. So, for example, the flowers that we see that are a little more blue, that means that the soil is more acidic, and the pink flowers show that the soil is more alkaline. But we'll keep making our way down the path, and I can't help but notice this gorgeous, very old and unique tree. And upon closer inspection, I see this isn't just any tree. This is a white mulberry tree, and it was dedicated to someone named John, who was clearly very beloved and very important to someone. And mulberry trees are quite interesting. This is really their time. If anyone should have a white or red or black mulberry tree in their yard, I know that there is one right behind my apartment building. And it is making a little bit of a mess, but the berries are perfectly edible for us and for birds, and they are quite delicious. And I do not encourage you to pick any berries from Central Park itself, because it's actually not allowed to pick or forage anything from a New York City public park. However, it's quite easy to find other mulberry trees all over New York City. If you don't have one in your own yard, you'll see one somewhere. And you can certainly try those mulberries if you don't happen to have any concerning allergies. But white mulberries were actually first brought here as a food source for silkworms. And I think people thought that they would start a silkworm industry here. And now some consider these to be an invasive plant, but the berries are quite delicious. But we'll continue on our walk down this path. And we're going to make a left up here. And we'll head under Riftstone Arch. And it's a pretty dark and sort of overcast day. And something about these plants, these kind of overgrown green plants growing on top of Riftstone Arch with just a little bit of what I believe is the San Remo peeking up behind it there, really gives it kind of a magical quality here, makes it feel like we're in some other kind of magical realm here. But let's head under. And I have to say that this is one of the spookier archways that I've ever made my way under in Central Park. It is especially dark. And what's interesting is looking ahead, we can see that the path is obscured. So we don't know what is around the bend up there, which is exactly what the designers wanted, so that we feel motivated to keep going forward and explore what we might discover right around the bend up there. Now, we are going to talk a little bit about trash, because you may have noticed that everywhere that we've walked so far in the park today has been quite tidy, but it wasn't always that way. It wasn't even always that way in New York City. Not that it necessarily is always so tidy in New York City now. I would say usually the park is looking a lot tidier than the rest of the city. But you know, even outside of the park in the 19th century, things were really not very clean. New Yorkers were known to actually dump their trash right onto the streets because it would be collected most often by scavengers before there was any sort of Department of Sanitation or Department of Street Cleaning, which was its first name. So, you know, everything would be dumped out on the streets. From your food waste like corn cobs and apple cores and whatever you hadn't finished, animal bones, and also all kinds of different animal manure that would all be dumped onto the streets. So if you think that New York City smells bad in the summer now, it certainly did in the 19th century. So no wonder folks were calling the parks the lungs of the city. That's what sanitary reformers referred to parks as, and they certainly must have been if that's what the air smelled like back then. But the New York City Department of Street Cleaning was instituted or established in 1881. And so what we're looking at here are pictures published by Harper's Weekly in 1895, showing before and after pictures of particular street corners after the establishment of the Department of Street Cleaning. And that Department of Street Cleaning was renamed the Department of Sanitation in 1933. So we can see a real difference here on East Houston Street. and also on the northeast corner of 4th Street and Avenue D. Now, one way that Central Park stayed clean, if that's how people were used to managing their trash, was really by enforcing certain rules and behaviors in Central Park and how people would use the park and could behave in the park. And so this was enforced in the beginning by park policemen that were referred to as sparrow cops. And they would enforce some of the many rules that Olmsted wanted to be observed in Central Park in order to sort of control how the park was being used and to protect the landscape, especially lawns. And these rules that folks had to observe included things like staying to the paths and not walking on any of the lawns so that people would not destroy the turf. It included not picking any flowers. All of these are kind of understandable rules. Maybe we now allow walking on the lawns, but there are times we close lawns to allow them to come back after a lot of crowd gatherings and experiencing soil compaction. And we still don't ask you to pick flowers. We ask you not to pick flowers. But other things were in the very beginning of the park, they actually banned group picnics. And I can't imagine picnics being banned in Central Park today. It's one of my favorite places to have a picnic. But banning those picnics really helped tamper down any littering that would have happened in the park. They also tried to keep down any peddlers selling things in the park. And in an effort to try to keep down any sort of littering, it also motivated the early park officials to provide their own refreshment establishments within the park so that people weren't motivated to bring their own packed lunches and then leave behind all matter of debris and litter from their packed picnic lunches. Now, today, of course, we encourage you to go on and come in for a picnic, but we also encourage you to be sure to carry out what you carry in. So be sure to bring all of your trash from your picnic to a receptacle that will likely be placed outside of the lawn that you're enjoying, or even better, if you can use a reusable container to pack your lunch or your picnic, and then you can bring it home and there's no trash whatsoever. And making our way out of Riftstone Arch here, back into the daylight, we see a beautiful glimpse of the Dakota building, which we also saw in that last photo from a totally different perspective. And again, these views kind of make me feel like I'm in a storybook. And we'll make our way down the path, feeling kind of nestled between these tall, rocky outcroppings that this walkway sort of blasted through, and these beautiful green, lush plantings. And still, things are looking quite neat here. But of course, it wasn't always this way in Central Park, as some of you may well remember. Here we see an interesting rock on the side. We can see that there was some erosion after the rain, but it does make an interesting visual effect here. We'll keep making our way down. And as I mentioned, it wasn't always so clean and green in Central Park. You may remember, some of you, in the 1970s, especially, there were trash cans sort of kept everywhere. You could find them all over the park. In fact, sometimes they were kept right in the middle of a lawn, or they were kept right in the middle of a woodland, which meant that the trucks that needed to pick up that trash needed to drive right across the lawn, which really was not very good. Like in this example that we see here. Now, the other thing that you'll notice is the Parks logo on this truck. And previously, the trash pickup was in part managed by the New York City Parks Department. But when the Central Park Conservancy was formed in 1980, eventually we took over full maintenance of the park by the 1990s, which allowed us to introduce some really compelling new strategies to make collecting the trash more efficient. And one of the ways that we did this was the implementation of a zone management system. So this allowed employees to feel responsible for their own individual zones that they managed. And they could really easily visually see the results of their work for their area that they were responsible and see how amazing it looked when they had kept that area well maintained. In fact, the previous president of Central Park Conservancy said, "You can restore a beautiful landscape, you can fix up a great building, but if there's trash on the ground, it doesn't matter. People will only see the trash and they don't like a dirty park." And I think we can all probably agree to that. Now, the Central Park Conservancy began recycling in 2007, and it was instituted park-wide by 2010. So how did we get to where we are today? You might recognize those trash cans that allow for trash and recycling, and those very well-designed cans that you'll see around the park today. Well, with a grant from the Alcoa Foundation, the Conservancy enlisted Landor Associates, their New York office, to collaborate on a new trash and recycling initiative. And the new design had a lot of goals. It needed to encourage visitors to recycle, it needed to make the collection of trash easier, and it also needed to look at home in the designed park of Olmsted and Box and not look like an eyesore. And so all of these considerations were factored into the design, along with concerns like, of course, pests, like raccoons and rodents and birds, and also considering sustainability, that the trash cans would last, and also safety. And with the new design and with the implementation of other strategies, we actually saw our recycling collection increase by 35%. And we also saw a dramatic reduction in pests. Now, can you still see a rat sometimes in Central Park? Yes, this is New York City, but you will see a drastic reduction in rats in the park because they can't get as easily at the trash. We've moved the trash cans, as I mentioned, outside of many landscapes. And so that tends to pull out some of those pests as well. And we see a real resurgence in our chipmunk population, thankfully. And today, it's important to note that in a single day, we collect about something over 2,000 tons of garbage a day and over 58 tons of recyclables. Now, moving on, we see here another example, a beautiful example of a hydrangea enjoying some of this wet weather and rain. And we can take a closer look at some of these really cool flowers. This is an oak leaf hydrangea. And we also see down by our feet as we make our way down the path, a nice little wildflower that some would call a weed, but this is one of my favorite, whether you call it a wildflower or a weed. This is fleabane. And it's named that supposedly because the smell is supposed to repel fleas. However, I really didn't notice any smell at all, but then I'm not a flea, so maybe the smell is just not designed for me. And we also noticed some beautiful berries. Now, according to my reading, these are not poisonous necessarily, but they're not really for our consumption, but they are beloved by birds. So you may have recalled earlier in the season, the beautiful big white snowball kind of flowers of Japanese snowballs, and these are their fruits. These are the berries of that same plant. And we'll keep making our way down the path. And it looks like someone is hard at work up here. And on our walk, we are running into Chad, who is a volunteer coordinator. And when I saw him, he had just finished working with a group of over 30 volunteers, all from a law firm, and they had assisted with mulching this large area and also clearing it of some trash and weeds. And it looks like he had quite a few people out here. They spread quite a bit of mulch. You can see the beautiful work that they did, and any trash or weeds they collected all bagged up and out of the way. And this is a perfect time to mention that we really can't keep the park looking as wonderful as we do without the work of our dedicated volunteers. So earlier, a few weeks ago, I had run into another one of our volunteer coordinators, Chris McDuff, who had also just finished working with some amazing volunteers. And he was noting how many pounds of trash that are picked up just by our volunteers. So in his meeting with them, they had picked up over 100 pounds of trash in just that meeting, so almost like a full person of trash. And one of the more interesting items they collected on that volunteer event was this interesting column that we see here on the right. So someone had disposed of this in Central Park. We're not sure of the origin of this. It's not actually a, ancient Greek column or anything, but it has now found its way safely out of Central Park, as it doesn't actually belong here. And of course, you can volunteer if you are interested in helping out in the park. And Jose will drop a link in the chat on how to sign up to be a volunteer with us here. And there are lots of different ways for you to help out in Central Park, or even if you are joining us from far away, you probably have a beloved park somewhere in your area. And so this is a perfect time to launch our poll and see how you keep your park, whether that's Central Park or another park near you, how do you keep it clean and green? So whether you dispose of all your trash in the proper receptacles, or do you primarily use reusable containers so there is no trash? Or perhaps you are a dog walker and you bring your dog to the park every day, but you make sure to always clean up after your dog. Maybe you are one of our many amazing volunteers joining us today on a weekly walk, or you're a volunteer in your own nearby park, so let us know. Or perhaps there's something else that you do. You can let us know in the comments some of the different ways that you help keep the park looking so clean and green. Now, Chad also noticed that I was checking out some of the plants, so he took a moment to point out some of the interesting species around us where he and the volunteers had just been mulching. And one of them was this really interesting beech tree that had some limbs that had fused into each other. So let's take a closer look. And here you can see the limbs have sort of grown right into each other, which is definitely not something you see all the time. But we'll continue on our way now. And let's see, I think most of you have answered our poll, and it looks like many of you said that you help keep the park clean and green by disposing all of your trash and your recycling in the proper receptacles. So thank you for doing that. Many of you use reusable containers, so you carry out what you carry in, which is awesome. Me too. I'm a big supporter of reusable containers, and if you're a huge fan of the park, you can also look on our gift shop for some of our own special Central Park branded reusable containers. And cleaning up after your dog, which is super important. I'm surprised we don't have more dog walkers on with us, but perhaps they're out walking their dogs right now. And we also have some volunteers, either perhaps some of our very own Central Park volunteers. So hello if you're there, and thank you. And great if you also perhaps volunteer in another park near you. So we'll keep going on our walk here as we wrap up our time together and make our way under the 77th Street stone archway. And again, things are looking quite clean and green. And I really like these kind of castle-like turrets on this stone archway that just adds to that overall feeling like you're in a kind of magical storybook realm in this nature walk along the west side here. And we're approaching a bit of a choice here in our paths. And of course, Robert Frost once said that he took the road less traveled and it made all the difference. But Yogi Berra said, if you come to a fork in the road, you should take it. But we are going to go ahead and take the left path and make our way along. And this is really a great example of a path very well maintained. You can even see some of those dapper looking trash cans up ahead. And I just want to give you an overview of sort of how we collect our trash here, because the trash management in Central Park is an organized effort between day and night shifts. And so we provide 24-hour coverage of collecting trash in Central Park. So from the morning to the late afternoon, we have zone gardeners, groundskeepers, and grounds technicians who are in 49 different zones, and they're responsible for trash management in their specific locations. And throughout their shift, they handle both horticultural tasks, but they also are picking up litter and making sure that the receptacles are clear and emptied and that the area is litter-free. And then night operations takes over in the afternoon until evening. And then we even have an overnight shift that runs from about 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., depending on the season. And there is a seasonality to trash pickup. Of course, we're entering our busy season when sometimes trash needs to be picked up as many as 7 times a day, whereas in the winter, sometimes the trash receptacle is cleared about twice a day. But we'll make our way around the path. And we see some orange cones showing us that we must be in an important area where work happens. And an important looking vehicle, of course, today, this being an exception, but many of our smaller vehicles are now electric vehicles, also helping to keep the park clean and green. And here we see a meeting of the minds or some of our other receptacles that may need to be repaired or perhaps recycled, because they are made of recycled materials, but then they themselves can also be recycled. And we end our walk here at the yard, where so many of the amazing hardworking folks who help to keep the park clean and green work out of the yard. So it's only appropriate that the yard is looking quite beautiful with these plantings of flowers that I saw CPC Central Park Conservancy employees planting just recently under this tree to add a little beauty of summer to the yard. As one way to sort of acknowledge the really amazing hard work that these folks do to keep the park as beautiful as it is, and able for all of us to enjoy every day. So we've made our way all the way up to the yard. And I want to let you know before we part ways about an upcoming tour that we have, our upcoming tour, Evening Art Stroll, which is a really unique tour that we have that will be in the evening. It's an hour long, looking at some of the artworks in the tour. So my colleague Jose can drop a link in the chat letting you know how to sign up for our Evening Art Stroll that will be starting Friday, July 7th. So something you could check out after work. But I want to thank all of you very much for joining us again today for a weekly walk and joining us every Wednesday. And thank you also for everyone in all the big and small ways that you help to keep the park looking clean and green, and simply by supporting our work here at the Central Park Conservancy that directly supports Central Park. So thank you. And on behalf of everyone here at the Conservancy, thank you, stay safe, be well, and we'll see you again next week. Bye, everyone. Thank you.